We're really fortunate this evening to have Natasha Lance Rogoff with us. Her book is when I first saw the book last May, when I got this big shipment from the Jewish Book Council, I turned to everybody in the office and like, I haven't looked at the book yet. I haven't met the author. We're bringing her in because it was too intriguing a subject. And when I heard you speak actually last May at the book conference that was on Zoom, and I thought to myself, this has got to be a cool story. And reading it turned out to be that and more. It was a totally fun read. So I encourage
Thank
you
you.
to pick up the book and do it. So welcome, teach us, tell us the story, and share your life with us.
Well, it's in terms of getting this gig, it's not something that I had anticipated ever, because I was a documentary filmmaker for many years and worked for, you know, doing PBS Frontlines, and I did not expect anybody to ask me to have anything to do with the Muppets, because the films I was doing were very serious. Uh, and dealt with economics and politics. And then these two, Sesame Street executives came to one of my screenings of the last documentary I had done then. This was in 1992, and it was a film called Russia for Sale: The Rough Road to Capitalism, where I had embedded with communist fascists, groups that were incredibly anti-Semitic, and made this film over 2 years, which then predicted the coup of 1991 that brought the Soviet Union to an end. So after they watched this film, they came up and said, we've been trying to bring the Muppets to Moscow and we need help. We're not having much success, and the US Congress is interested in financing this. So I just looked at them and I thought, they were crazy. I was like, did you just watch my film? I mean, I don't know what I could possibly, what could give you the idea that I could help you in any way with a children's puppet show? And the guy who was interviewing me, for, as I guess he thought he was interviewing me, was in his 30s and very charming, and then convinced me to come down to the studio on the Upper West Side in New York, opposite Lincoln Center. So I did. I went down there, and you know the the place was like electric, with all these giant posters of photographs of Big Bird and Elmo on the walls, and um, I I they explained to me that their vision was that, and this was at the time, then Senator Biden, who was spearheading congressional support for a Sesame Street show, an original Russian version of Sesame Street. And the idea was that the ambassadors would model idealistic values like tolerance and compassion and freedom of expression. So that's where the whole idea came from, and it was incredibly ambitious, as well as would involve hundreds and hundreds of artists. So, and these are not just Russians, these are like Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians. The idea was that everybody would be working together to create this new puppet show for post-communist USSR, meaning that the idea was the show would be broadcast across 11 time zones, and would be seen by tens of millions of children. So of course I was really intrigued by this, and the idea of, doing something that was entertainment oriented after the films I had done, which were so depressing for the most part, but also, it was just such a different genre that I was really intrigued. And so I said yes. And that's how that whole thing came about. And it of course changed the rest of my life.
That's so cool. I mean, the serendipity of it all is like, um, so looking back on it, did the Russians need Sesame Street? Do they still? Who else needs it in the world?
It's definitely. I mean, it was hugely popular. It was a hit as soon as it came out. There at this time, you're talking about the 1990s when the entire Soviet Union had collapsed and there was really no center administration running anything. So the medical care system collapsed, the education system collapsed. There were no textbooks for education. The curriculums for preschool were all based on communism and teaching communist values, and were very oriented around the glorification of Lenin. So when communism fell, there was also no money in the budget for the Russian state to support television production. So Sesame Street served an enormous function at that time. We can show this video, the book trailer, where you'll even hear from the Deputy Minister of Education, where she argued in front of the US Congress to have this program for their country, supported by the Congress, but also supported with funding from Russia too, so that it was a joint production.
Why don't we put on the trailer? Danny, can you do that?
Yep.
That's not, it's the other one. It's that one, yeah.
Is to create a program that has never existed here before, which introduces children into the world of learning in a very joyful way and makes them understand that they can achieve anything that they want to in the future.
Какое-то такое первое прочтение ребенка.
Our kids have to share something. Let them share not Terminator, not Rambo, which is now the case, but Sesame Street.
So I'm struck by the smiles of the kids in those pictures. And I had this flashback of there's a scene early in the book, I don't know what chapter it is, where you're sitting down with the puppeteers, the Russian puppeteers, and they're saying, no, we're not interested in your Muppets. We want our own. And you get this no kind of, and I can't imagine there was a smile to be found or to be bought or anything else.
Not in the beginning. Yeah.
How did you have the confidence to take this thing on? Yeah, how do you not just go curl up in a corner and say, fine, you're out. I'll go to Mexico and do the Mexican one.
Well, I had already lived in Russia for 10 years, like before they asked me to do this. And I loved being there. I loved the country. I had close friends, it was my life. I mean, this is a time when in America, you think about where we were in the 1990s, everything was framed for me personally in the context of the Holocaust, I think. And I looked at people who were part of resistance. And even at age 14, I was like, these are my heroes. And as I was meeting people, I'd sit there in my, the kind of person I was where I was just reading all the time and think, what side would they be on? Would they be a resistor? Would they collaborate? Who are these people? You know, like it was like a barometer that I was looking at the world through. And, you know, then became really fascinated with communism because it was also a dictatorship. And I wanted to see it up close. I couldn't believe that humans could treat humans like this. It was just something I couldn't understand, you know? So that's why I went, I think, the first time. And once I got there, which I still believe to this day, it is an incredible country. You know, not only is it, you think about what Russians have contributed to the world in terms of culture, but because the society was not influenced by the capitalist system in the same way, it led to people's interactions being different. And because they were subject to the private sphere, you know, being separated from the public sphere of propaganda and oppression, also this impacted relations.
Sure.
And so, you know, when Sesame Street asked me to do this, I, you know, I was thrilled. I mean, I didn't think I had the skill set or what it would take to do it. Like I was definitely scared. And, you know, as soon as I got there, you know, from having read the book, you know, but I totally underestimated the challenges because it was a very different country from the one I had been living in, this
Yeah.
under the Soviet Union. And, you know, we had to deal with people getting assassinated during the production and very difficult emotional situations. Those things were challenging before too. Like I did films on underground rock and roll and followed the musicians who'd been persecuted under communism and weren't allowed to
But
do it.
before you had been almost in the role of a reporter telling their stories.
Yes.
This time it was different. This one you were
Oh,
trying
yeah.
to change.
It was very different. That's totally true, Danny,
That's
because
been hard.
yeah, it was more, it involved more stress. Like I always knew I could leave if I was, you know, shooting. I was always shooting for the West. So you're always shooting for ABC or 2020 or, you know, or
Yeah.
PBS. And then this was different. Suddenly I was in the same group with these people. Anything that was happening to me too, and making my life hell. I knew I could always leave, unlike the people I was with. Like, I mean, they could leave, but nobody could. Nobody had any money. Um, but there was no question of leaving at any point. I mean, my boyfriend at the time, you know, was constantly saying, okay, this is too much. This is just, you know, this is crazy, crazy, you know, when people were killed that you had to deal with, that sort of thing. And people, you know, who love me in the States, they were worried,
I'm sure. I can
you know,
only imagine the flack you would have been getting from your loved ones at home saying, "What are you doing?"
yeah.
Yeah.
And but I was, you know, I had very close friends. My best friend was my business partner, Leonid. I'd worked with him on many of my films before this. I brought him in. I built the team. It's my team. Now, I knew if I left, it would fall apart. I knew that. And
You need to look you in the eye and say, "Drop this thing and walk away."
there was only one time. I mean, I wrote about this in the book, but there was one time when I'm trying to remember if it was after, I think it was after the office was taken over by soldiers with AK-47s, and we lost everything. We lost all the scripts, all the set design, everything, all the computer equipment, and we weren't going to get it back. It was just like, bye. All that work you did is gone. Start
Right.
again, you know. And I think it was after that where I came back to New York. He came over and we went out to a Italian restaurant in the village. And he said, I said, I really didn't know what to do. And I was just so sad, because so much work had happened. And I was, just didn't have the energy. I was just like, it was like a gut punch after that. And there were no cell phones. So like trying to rally the group together and find everybody, it was really going to be super difficult. And, um, and he just said, look, if you want to quit, I'll quit. He said, even though, this is a great job for me and I'm making money and I'm happy, but if you've had too much and you don't want to do it, that's fine with me. Just let's stop then.
So in a world where there's so much chaos and so much transition and transformation and fear, how did he have the courage to do all of this stuff? Because on some level, the risk he was taking was much bigger than the risk you were taking, because you
He's
could always
very-
get back to the US.
Yeah, he's very courageous and he still lives in Moscow. And he was courageous even during the communist era as a Jew who, where Jew is stamped on your passport.
Yeah.
And he was able to go to Moscow journalism school where they took almost no Jews. I was very, very bright person. And he wrote the first expose of political prisoners in psychiatric hospitals.
Hmm.
And that's how I met him.
Hmm.
And I met him when I was working for NBC, and the NBC producer, put us all together. We went out to dinner together and he said, this is my fixer from Russia.
Yeah.
And I sat there and he kept telling these jokes and I was laughing and everything. And then he goes, I think you're one of the tribe. And I said, I am like this. And, we just became best friends. And he's still
Wow.
my best friend. I talk to him now about every 2 weeks on WhatsApp in
Wow.
Moscow.
So
And we watched our
how does he
kids
do it?
grow
How,
up. Yeah.
how does he do it? How does he must have a spine of steel.
He is very, he's like a character. Well, I mean, I wrote him as he is in the book, but he literally is a fantastic character, like even in a Russian novel, the kinds of risks that he
He
takes.
felt like a literary character reading it. I mean,
Well, he is. If you talk to him, he's so funny. He just opens his mouth and he's like, whatever he says is, he just is very present. And he's older now and he's had a stroke. So, he's not the same energy level or the same fearlessness. But when he was younger, he was just fearless.
yeah,
And, of course, in Russia too, the whole concept of rules is very different than in America.
yeah.
And he was willing to break all kinds of rules to achieve anything. And especially to achieve the pursuit of truth.
So I'm happy to keep going the conversation, but Cantor, I know you read the book, so I want to open it up. So if you have any questions or thoughts you want to share, by all means, kick me out of the way.
If we talk about the actual production of the show, can you talk about, I know it's some of it's in the book, but you can also remind us of some of the elements that were put into the show that you didn't know if they worked or not until after it had been produced. And I know some of the things, there were a couple of things that didn't maybe land as you anticipated.
I'm trying to think of what you're thinking of, but I mean, in the beginning, there were a lot of disagreements over the curriculum for the show and what was going to go into the show and what the, educators from Russia, Russians, Ukrainians, everybody wanted to teach their children. And, Sesame Street's a very progressive show. So there were many discussions where the group of educators and some of the creative people didn't want to include these elements in the production. And, the most salient was the Muppets themselves being they didn't want the Muppets at all, and, wanted to use their own puppets in their Sesame Street show. And Danny, we can pick up the pictures of, initially they wanted it to be based on their, if you go down slide, like maybe try 5. Yeah. So they wanted to use their puppets. And of course for months and months, they refused to develop even designs for Muppets. And so then eventually, after they visited the US, they agreed to draw a design for Muppet based on their own folklore. And if you go to slide 6, they wanted to base it on this character, Domovoy, who's the spirit of the hearth and the home. And you see what he looks like. So from my perspective, it was terrifying. So, but eventually there's a whole process where I write about this in the book too, but they eventually make the most amazing, just the most brilliantly creative character on the left, Zeliboba, who's a tree spirit. And he's like Domovoy because he's at one with nature, and he lives inside a 40-foot oak tree. So that's, that was one transition. There were other ones too, like the whole concept of the music, where initially the head chief director of music only wanted classical music in their Sesame Street show. And that was yet another battle. And it wasn't me who changed her mind. It was a rock musician who's a friend of mine, and they ended up finding common ground. And eventually she became the most incredible champion of all the young people in their various types of contemporary music.
Great, thank you. Did you have, going in a totally different direction, did you have any connection with the Russian Jewish community at the time when you were living there or working on the show? And do you take any reflection on that? I mean, I know
I did in the 1980s, when there were a lot of things going back and forth with refuseniks. And I knew a lot of musicians who were Jewish, but I was never, I don't think that, I mean, I remember there was one film I did where the Jewish question came up, and it was about nationalities. And many of my friends, including my closest friend Leonid, was Jewish. So, but there really wasn't this, I mean, we had many friends who weren't Jewish. People who were Jewish were not really educated as Jews. So a lot of people didn't know anything about being Jewish who were Jewish. They didn't know about the holidays, or they just knew nothing because, their own parents had not really brought them up Jewish. But actually, even in terms of their language was different. So the accent was different among families where they were from Jewish, backgrounds. And I could hear that difference too. So I was able to tell, who was Jewish and who wasn't. And in terms of the show itself, I would say it wasn't an issue at all, really, except one time when we had a situation, an incident that happened with the foreman, who was Jewish, and a couple of the crew members made some anti-Semitic comments. And I immediately put the kibosh on that. And, we never had anything, but many people on our team were Jewish. I mean, if you think about it, Leonid, Robin, me, I think that's it. And everybody else was not.
You and Leonid were sort of the heart of the thing, and you were both Jewish, and that undercurrent kept popping. I mean, I kept noticing that.
Yeah, well, I think it's a lot of the way that, you know, the voice, like when I'm writing, that's who I am. So it's gonna come through. And then also um the head writer, Nana, is Jewish from she's half Armenian and half Russian.
You talked about Leonid a little bit. What about the rest of the folks you've worked with? Are you still in touch with them? What's become of them?
Well, I was very much in touch with everybody when I had to write the book, and some of the people I hadn't talked to in years. And I interviewed over 50 people. And then the publisher made me get signed release forms for every quote that they give in the book. It
Wow.
was a nightmare.
Wow.
So you can imagine what that's like. It's like being a detective, tracking people down and everything.
Hey,
It was very difficult. And since then the war, then Putin invaded Ukraine, and then I sent a text to everybody that was very neutral. You know, I'm so sorry this has happened. This is a very sad day for, you know, us and Sesame Street, blah, blah. And then I stayed in touch with a number of them, talking about the war. And then once Putin passed the rule about not speaking out against the war, I no longer was texting anything of political content because it could be dangerous.
sure.
And all the conversations now do not deal with politics, as even with Leonid.
So talk for a second. In the book, you weave in the story of meeting your husband and that whole thing opening up and then having kids, and talk for a little bit about how you dealt with this with your kids. Like, you know, were your kids raised as Sesame kids? Were they raised as Russian Sesame kids, as an American Sesame kids? Were you
Oh,
raised a Sesame kid? You know, how
I
did
was
you?
not, yeah, yeah, I'm too old. I was born in 1960 and Sesame Street started in 1969.
Yeah.
So I was already aged out of Sesame Street, but I was of course familiar with it, you know, having grown up around it and being from New York. Of course, I, you know, knew Sesame Street. But my own kids, I did not let them watch television when they were little. I mean, I was a TV producer by then, making children's television, but I banned the TV. And the only
Pull
thing
that up.
I know, and the only thing I let my son watch, Gabriel, was videotapes of Winnie the Pooh. And that was for years. He wasn't exposed to any television. I
You
think
were working on Sesame and you wouldn't let them watch. You wouldn't want your own kids watch Sesame.
no, I was very anti internet and anti digital. I was really old school. And
Wow.
then when my daughter came up, she watched it, but they didn't, you know, she didn't love it. My son was, by then he was too old for it, but my daughter, you know, she liked they had Nickelodeon and Disney and all that stuff and the princess this and that, and you know, so by that point I had lost control. And and my daughter definitely saw more television than my son. And it wasn't Sesame Street so much.
Wow.
Yeah.
Speaking of kids, can I come in with a question?
Please.
Yeah.
Everybody else
How
has questions too. I don't, you know.
how did you connect with the kids that were working on Sesame Street? And also, like, how did you deal with these really big, intense political issues in a way that I don't know if like you mentioned them so much on Sesame Street, but how did you like bearing all of that in mind of what these kids were living through? How did that inform what you put on the show?
Well, that's a really good question because very often in the discussions about what the curriculum was going to be, the Russian educators and the writers would say, you know, these children are going through a traumatic experience as their country is changing. And, you know, there were food shortages, the ruble devalued by 25% a month. There was extreme poverty. It was a very difficult time, and no security, you know, in the same way that the communist state had offered security, you know, limited in terms of many aspects of it, but it was a level of security, housing, food, things like that, basic medical care. And so when we were trying to push the envelope and bring in issues that may have been too radical, let's say, for the kids to grasp, sometimes they would say that we needed the show to be familiar. And that's where the whole idea of classical music came from. You know, all of Russian animated films for children was, you know, done with classical music. And so here we were talking about doing this new pace of a show, and many of the educators said, oh, it's too frenetic. It's too frenetic for these children who already are stressed out. They didn't use the word stressed out. I don't think stressed out exists in Russian in the same way. But we were sensitive to that and to how they wanted to both address the music or other issues, and then test it to see if they were right. You know, did the children get stressed out, or did they not like it? Did they like it? You know, how fast could it be? Things like that. So all of these elements were tested with kids, and we got a better idea of what was working and what was leading to better retention in terms of learning as well. So all of the testing part of it, the research part, was really important. And I also think there were some places where you know, they made it clear that there were certain segments. This came especially with the percentage of segments that were dubbed. And, you know, one example is there was a spoof about Superman with Super Grover. And the writers were like, we don't understand this segment at all. We don't see why it's funny. And then eventually they explained that they don't know what Superman is. They never saw Superman. They don't, you know, so a lot of the pop culture elements that were in some of the segments, they didn't translate. Another one was the Three Little Pigs spoof, where the pig, you know, that blows the houses down, then sets up his own company to teach people how to rebuild their own houses. And the Russians are like, well, we don't have private properties, so we don't understand what you're talking about, build a house. You know, and there were all these funny elements that just were very revealing about their society.
Speaking of all of these culture clashes, and maybe your answer is pick up, this is a great selling point for the book because I will be reading it after this. But this takeover of the studio has been hinted at a couple of times between the trailer and this talk. Can you just tell that story? Because I need to know what happened.
It was you really, it's like a spoiler, because if you're reading the book, it's gonna spoil. They've already read the book, but are you sure you want me to?
If you're willing to spoil, I'll read it anyways.
It's an astounding story. I mean, like,
Yeah. Basically, I was getting married in America, and we had an office in the studio. This is Russia's largest TV station, the same station now where Putin does, you know, transmits all his propaganda. It's a building the size of 2 football fields.
Wow.
And I worked in this building. I had a pass. I would go anywhere in the building. It was just completely open, not like now. And we had the office on the 11th floor, which was the executive floor, because my colleague who had helped me since the beginning, he was the head of the cultural department for television. So he arranged for us to get this office. And that was the same floor that was then taken over by soldiers with AK-47s. So they came in and they basically walked down the hall, went into each office, told the people they had 10 minutes to get out and, take whatever you want. And nobody knew what was going on. Nobody knew this was happening, what was causing this at all. And they just went from one office to the other so that they could seize the floor. And it was the floor that manages the TV station. So basically, it was a grab for the TV station in order to control the content because of the elections coming up and everything else, and to control the hearts and minds of not just Russia, but the other former republics that were now independent countries, because they wanted them back. And anyway, it was a very scary time, and really sad, because, as I say, it was, I didn't know what we were going to do. And then gradually, very quickly, all the team was able to connect with each other by sort of not telephone tag, but like meeting and speaking, because nobody had phones either. Like, phones were expensive. So the group ended up coming together in apartments, and not a single person quit. And they weren't paid for months because our financial structure was destroyed too.
Wow, that's insane.
So, naturally we look back and say, I wish I would have done this one differently, or I wish I could have a do-over on that. Looking back on it, are there moments where you're like, wow, look what we accomplished? Look, how do we have the guts to do that? I mean, do you give yourself credit for what you pulled off? Have you gotten to?
I mean, that's why I wrote the book. I mean, I think it was a remarkable story. It was remarkable that we succeeded and that the book was so successful. But the greatest pleasure that I get is, now that the book's out, is all these people I'm meeting. I was just in Miami doing a talk, and this Russian woman comes up to me and says, thank you so much, for making this show. This was my childhood. I grew up on this show. I then showed the tapes to my children. They grew up on the show. And she said, and thank you for speaking about my people and our country the way you did, with such empathy and understanding, because they're dealing with cancel culture of Russians and everything.
Sure.
Same thing with Ukrainians. I was in London. There's so many Ukrainians in London now, refugees. And I was just meeting one Ukrainian after another who grew up on the show. And, it's very meaningful because the show lasted, for 10 years, like well into Putin's era. So all the kids now, this just happened. Actually, I was at the airport like last week, and I met this woman and then posted on Instagram a picture with her, and she just couldn't believe it, because she grew up on Ulitsa Sezam too.
So let me ask you to make two predictions. One, when does this become a movie, and is it a documentary or a feature film, or what's it look like? And two, how long after Putin falls does the show come back?
Well, your first question is yes, the book's been optioned as a film and also as a documentary.
Oh.
And the film probably takes 4 or 5 years, that's my guess. Who knows? And then the documentary usually takes 2 years. And the when will Sesame Street come back? I think fairly quickly after, Russia turns. But a lot of people left. 2 million people left. It's a lot of people, a lot of brains being forced to start new lives elsewhere. So what this country is going to be like in the future really depends on whether, people will go back, or will they start with what they have. If they have to start with what they have there, it'll take longer, but because they won't have the training of the people who left. But they're still amazing. I mean, I'm in touch with people who are 20 now, and they're still incredibly smart, and they have dreams. The 20-year-olds, they're not, they don't want this. And people are forced to be silent because they don't want to go to jail, for 15 years. They're just, there's a lot of, the propaganda is very effective. The longer Putin is in power and spewing out the propaganda and having the propaganda in the education system, it'll take the same amount of time for Russia to change. But one thing we know about Russia is that Russia always changes.
So
It's volatile.
do you think it's possible to have an Iranian Sesame Street someday? Or
Yeah, I mean, there's a Syrian one in Arabic. There's one in Afghanistan. There's one in Ukraine. Yeah. But they have to let you in, and you have to work with their people. And if you're, Sesame Street is not going to work with terrorists. The Sesame Street for Israel did not work. Israel, Palestine. So
Rahov Tsum Tsum had a good run.
it's still running.
Right. So
But
that
but in the 90s, they tried to do a partnership with the Palestine PLO, whatever the TV station in I don't remember if it was where it was exactly, but I was in those early meetings and I opted out.
I don't know, Cantor, I don't know if you watched Rahov Tsum Tsum when you lived in Israel in cantorial school. I know when I was in rabbinical school, I remember watching it a little bit just to test my Hebrew to see could I catch what was going on and follow it.
We watched it in Hebrew school.
Did you?
Yeah, like bits and pieces.
Yeah. I can remember watching it. I mean, I wasn't home in the middle of the day that much, but I can remember watching it and testing myself, being like, okay, let's see if I can do this.
Well, that's very impressive that you could understand the Hebrew.
It wasn't always so good. There were days and then there were days. But it was, I mean, I remember watching it early and then watching it late in the year, and the difference between what I could pick up in October and say April was real. I mean, that was noticeable. So
Yeah, it was good. It was a good show. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess it was what broke it was Rabin being killed. That's what ended it.
what other questions do you guys have? I want to open up to everybody else. I don't mean to hog the floor here.
What's next for you besides optioning your book into a movie?
Well, I'm working on both of those, so I'll be producing with them, and I have to organize all the footage and translation stuff and transcripts and all that. And then I'll work with the feature film team to cast and do everything. So I'm going to do that next.
Wow, you're gonna be playing a lot of parts in that. That's so cool. Bless you.
Yeah. So that would be really fun.
So if you end up with grandkids, are you going to expose them to this?
To Sesame Street?
Yeah, and to the whole story of what you did with the Russian.
Well, I have a feeling it won't be me. It'll be my kids who will be exposing, because I'll be too old. My kids are 25 and 27, and they are they're not gonna have kids right away. So, Ken is 71 now, who knows? We'll see. But yeah, I would love to show them Sesame Street, and they'll have the book and they'll have the film and the documentary, and that'll be nice for them to see this piece of their past, which is, it's kind of amazing because my grandfather left Russia in 1912, Belarusia.
Yeah.
And then I went back, and it's weird. It's like a weird idea that you can just go back and forth and but I'm so glad he left.
While you were
Uh,
there, did you ever go back to the town where your grandparents came from and try and track down any of that stuff?
my cousin did. And we know exactly, they have so much information about the town and everything near Minsk, near Pinsk.
Yeah.
It was like a shtetl. But I did not go there. I was in Minsk filming, and it was so bombed after World War II that most of the buildings were, cement reconstruction. It was an incredibly ugly place.
Hmm.
And not like Moscow or St. Petersburg. And I just was glad he left. I mean, I just was like, thank God that,
Yeah.
he made that decision. And I have 4 siblings. So, it's just the continuation of that. But
My father did a Fulbright in Ukraine in 2009 and was able to track down the shtetls in Ukraine where the family came from. And at one set of his grandparents, great grandparents, ran an inn, and he asked where the inn was. And the Ukrainian local said, "Oh, the Jews Inn. Yeah, it's down this street and around the corner, but be careful, they have roaches there." And this was in 2009. It was like
the Jews in.
the Jews Inn and cockroaches. There were no more Jews left in that town than there were cockroaches, and there weren't very many cockroaches. Yeah, there was.
Well, it's amazing Zelensky's the president now. It's
Yeah.
just surreal.
all
And
that was all that was left of the Jews was the hate. There was no. Yeah.
yes, yes. No, that's very true. And I know during when Ukraine was opening up, there were so many different Jewish organizations over there trying to build up again.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure, I mean, there's nothing, I can't imagine there's anything there now. But I do know people that are going there to work, as part of the reconstruction. Like there will definitely be a very extensive reconstruction of Ukraine once this settles wherever the border is going to be.
When will you go back to Russia?
I can't go back anymore. Yeah, it's too dangerous for me. I mean, after they're just arresting Americans like that, no, I'm not going back.
I mean,
I mean,
if
I'll see my friends in another place, and many of them left, since Putin passed that law, and they resettled with asylum. The Jewish ones were able to get asylum in Germany and some other places. But I would not feel safe there now.
so until Putin falls, you're stuck.
Well, I don't know what's going to happen. Will there be Putin 2.0, or who knows what's going to happen?
Yeah.
But in any case, people that I see people, but they come out of Russia. You don't want to put yourself in Russia where you're just subject to the judicial system there. That's crazy. If even the journalists there are many American journalists there still and British, and they're deciding that they can be there. But I have a friend who, was working for the New York Times, and he was going to go. And I said, as a journalist, I understand that why you want to go. And it's such a draw because it's an incredible time to go too. But if I'm imagining I'm your mother, I'm like, I think it's great if you don't go because you have children and you have a wife, and this is not the best time. So he didn't go actually, but I think in my case, I don't feel safe in the same way that I felt safe before.
But we're just about out of time. Cantor, I don't know if you have any last questions you want to add, or anybody else. I just want to say thank you. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for sharing the story, and for joining us. It was
Thank you
fascinating.
for reading it.
Oh.
Thank you for reading it and for having me. And Danny, I hope you enjoy it too.
I will, and I will definitely be sending you emails with all of my thoughts and all of my questions when I finish it.
That sounds great. And I loved your questions. So thank you so much for making the time.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much for coming to talk to us.
Have a
Cool.
great evening.
You too.
great
Take
evening.
care.
Bye.
Bye.